You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio joining you. It's Saturday, January 18th of the year 2025. Big win for IU men's basketball last night as they knock off Ohio State at Ohio State. We're going to talk with one of our longtime CrimsonCast listeners and occasional contributors who was there, and we're going to check in with her on what that experience was like. It was a wild game for those of you who are watching on television. I know it was certainly wild. I was watching with some friends at Heartwork Brewing Company in Bloomington, which if you haven't tried that spot out, I would recommend it. Really good beer and a nice open space in there, and they were nice enough to put the game on television. It's actually the second year in a row I've been at Heartwork watching Indiana at Ohio State, and both games have been kind of nuts. Last year, Anthony Leal hits that shot at the end to win, and this year, a big play at the end of overtime, and they end up picking up the victory there. So anyway, we're going to talk about the game, kind of a shorter podcast today, so we'll focus on that, and looking forward to seeing what happens here over the next couple of weeks, obviously, with IU. It's going to be interesting, as we talked about in our last podcast. Certainly a lot of negative possibilities, but also some positive possibilities as well, as this Indiana team is truly talented enough that they could win pretty much any game on the schedule. It's just the consistency that's the issue. And it was nice to see some of that last night and some more fight, especially on the defensive end, than what we saw in the couple of previous games. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But first of all, just a reminder, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, and you can use the code HOME23, again, HOME23, get 15% off your first order. Plenty of IU apparel. I'm wearing one of them right now, one of my favorite crew necks, and plenty of apparel for hundreds, literally hundreds of college teams across the country. It's certainly hoodie season right now. So might as well go ahead and grab yourself a couple of hoodies. Use that code, get 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. Also, just a reminder, we are on Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com. It's free to sign up. You get emails delivered right to your inbox with our podcasts. And there's a paid subscriber option. You occasionally get some extra VIP videos, largely there to help financially support the podcast if you so choose. We certainly appreciate all you folks who have signed up. And just a reminder, also subscribe to our YouTube channel. It is Back Home Network on new YouTube. Over 7,000 subscribers now, and we continue to pump out content on a regular basis. And if you like not just listening to the podcast, but also watching them, that's a great place to do it. So again, head over to the YouTube channel, and we'd love to have you, not just for CrimsonCast, but for all of the other shows within the Back Home Network family. Okay, and we'd like to welcome, I think for the first time officially on the show, we've got Allie Sanzenbacher. Some of you may know her from her time in IU sports media as Allie Hausfeld. But Allie has, we've been communicating pretty regularly for the last 9 years about IU and Ohio State and all these things. And she was at the game last night. And this is, I feel like you and we need to more fully explain how the IU Ohio State Allie perspective on things has blossomed here over the last year, especially. So tell the people first of all where you're positioned in all of this right now, because it's fascinating to me.
First of all, if you're watching on the video, I am sporting my Back Home Network t-shirt. So I'm really pumped to be on the podcast for the first time. It was actually a Christmas present from my sister.
Your sister knows where to shop. This is good. So.
Oh yeah. So I graduated from IU in 2016. Not yet the media school. I was actually part of the School of Public Health. So I always like to laugh about my Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology.
Something you and I share. That was where I taught before the media school launched. So that's where we met each other. Yes.
Yes. So I moved to Toledo, Ohio after graduation and worked for the CBS affiliate there as a reporter. And I met my now husband there who played football at Ohio State. We ended up moving back to Columbus. Well, I hadn't been in Columbus, but in 2019. So I've been living here since 2019. He now works for the radio station here doing some Ohio State football commentary. They don't talk about basketball that often, but whenever they do, I'm like, hey, here's what you need to know. Here are your tidbits, because, I'm trying to watch Big Ten basketball as much as I can. But so I always try to catch IU when they're in Columbus, but obviously not the result I wanted on the football side, but I'll take the win last night. And I was at the game last year when they came back in the second half with my brother, and we both said that was one of our favorite IU away games that we had ever been to. Regardless of what was happening during that season, it was just an exhilarating comeback.
It's interesting because, I think we've all experienced this if we've followed IU for any length of time, and especially if we've been to road games. You can have seasons that just aren't going well, and then you'll have a game where it's like, wow, that was incredible, or like, how did that work out the way that it did? It happens at home too. I remember like the first time I think that IU won against Wisconsin under Tom Crean. It was not a great season. It was 2014, and it was like a double overtime game, and it's like, where did that come from? And so maybe I'm mixing that up with the first time Archie Miller beat Washington or Wisconsin. I can't quite tell, but yeah, a fascinating game last year when Indiana went to Ohio State, and not too different in terms of like some of the implications. That was a game where Indiana had lost, I think, 4 of their previous 5 last year. They go in, there's not a lot of hope, and they play Ohio State pretty tough, and then they end up with a chance at the end, and a big shot gets knocked down by Anthony Leal. And that was kind of the last straw, it felt like, for the Chris Holtmann era at Ohio State, because he got fired not terribly long after that, right?
Yeah, no, they had one more game on the road after that, but that was like their last home game. I mean, we bought tickets the day of. We were like 6th row. I think they were like $10 a piece. I mean, people had at that point in Columbus had kind of given up. So when IU was down by, I think it was 18 in the second half, I was like, all right, well, this.
Okay, we had some technical difficulties there. Sorry for that, but we're back. I think we're good to go. And we were talking about, it was the end of the Chris Holtmann era last time you were at the game, essentially, like right afterwards, and there wasn't a lot of it. I am curious, before we move on, like, how many people generally go to basketball games at Ohio State when they're not like a top 10 team?
I mean, even last night, like the upper section, it's such an interesting arena because it reminds me so much more of an NBA arena. It's a very comfortable place to watch a basketball game. Yeah. And that's something that Dane and I talk about often, is like, maybe if it wasn't so comfortable, it wouldn't be so quiet in here, because it's like, it's almost like you're just like enjoying the viewing experience. Like, you're not a fan of the game. Like, you're not as close to the court, and it's kind of spread out more. It's a great venue for concerts, but yeah, like the 300 level, I mean, you could sit anywhere you wanted up there. There was barely anyone there last night. And we went to the game against Oregon. I mean, same thing. They just don't have a ton of excitement around that program until they have, a ranked number by their school.
Right. And it's been a weird year for them this year, where they've beaten Kentucky on a neutral floor, and they beat Texas, but then they've had other games where they've struggled. And obviously, they're under a new coaching staff, and, they looked like they were in really good shape from a net perspective, and I think they were like 30th in KenPom. And this was a game that, according to the numbers, Indiana wasn't supposed to win. I think Ohio State was something like a 5 or 5.5 point favorite. So we obviously saw what happened with Indiana in the last couple of games, particularly that Illinois game. So what are you thinking going into the arena in this game?
I mean, honestly, I wasn't that excited about it, but I guess I was less anxious than I think I normally would have been if we weren't coming off of 2 25-point losses, only because it's like, well, it can't really get any worse. Yeah. It can't get worse than what we've seen the last 2 games. So part of me was like, I just think that like that Illinois game had to be some sort of breaking point.
Right.
I mean, we heard it after the game from Luke Goode and Anthony Leal. And I was like, I just doubt that they don't show up in this game. Whether them showing up is going to be enough to win, it kind of just depends which Ohio State team shows up.
Yeah, and let's talk about Indiana first. I mean, they certainly showed up, although it was interesting how that manifested, because Luke Goode, I think, ends up with a season high in minutes, and was offensively you could probably say he was the key player, but it was really close with Oumar Ballo, who also played a significant number of minutes. Both like Ballo played 40, Luke Goode played 41. Ballo had 21 points and 15 rebounds. Goode hit 4 threes in the game and all of his free throws. And like you could tell on television, and I'm curious what it was like there. Like it really felt like those two in particular were just kind of dragging Indiana up the hill, especially as they started to make that comeback coming out of the first half and into the second half.
Yeah, I felt like there were still things during that game that were the same things that have frustrated fans this whole season, like the shot selection at times, getting driven. The amount of and ones that Ohio State had was just infuriating. But I just felt like the intensity was there, like Ohio State would punch, and Goode even talked about this after the game. Like, if you're going to get down 6 points, we can't just give up. I felt like the defensive intensity was there, even though there were still lapses of people ball watching and losing their guy. And then there's an open three. But I just felt like every time they would go back, especially to the defensive end, it was like they were still bringing that intensity that was just straight up not there at Illinois.
Yeah, no, it was interesting because one of the things about this IU team that's been frustrating is you never know when the intensity is going to come. And there's games where it just doesn't happen at all. Or there's games like Illinois where it's not there in the first half and then it's there in the second half for a little bit and then it kind of goes away again. This game was pretty even to start with. We got to about the 10-minute mark and I think it was 18-16 or 18-18. And it was like, okay, well, this is going to be one of those just back and forth types of games. And then Ohio State goes on this run. And I think at one point they were up 9. It was like 30, or maybe I take that back. It was 33-26. So they were up 7, but it felt like things could really tip over for Indiana. At that point, I think Ohio State was at their highest winning percentage, which was at like 89.2%, which is normally pretty hard to come back from. Did you feel like at halftime Indiana had it in them to come back in this game, or did it feel like things had started to unravel at that point?
I mean, honestly, it's such an interesting thing, again, watching the game there, because I didn't feel like the crowd was going to take IU out of it until Ohio State started going on that run with like 3 minutes left in the game and IU couldn't score. Then it seemed like they were a little rattled by the crowd because that was the first time we'd really heard them. But at halftime, I mean, I'm like, okay, Miles Rice sat, 16 minutes of that half? I still felt like being down 6 at that point with the abysmal shooting performance that we saw. I was like, okay, I don't think they can't come back from this.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, and the second half was really fascinating because, Indiana comes out and they get all the way back in, they tie the game, they start to take the lead, and then they just blow it wide open with about 7 minutes to go. And I think at one point it was tied or close to tied. I think it was 55-54 Ohio State. And then 4 minutes later, it was 68-58 Indiana. And you're like, oh, this is great. They've won the game. There's 5 minutes to go. They're going to coast to victory here. And then, as you said, that comeback happens. Ohio State over the last 3 minutes of the game and the first part of overtime was on a 12-1 run. And it's like, how did this happen again? Like, how did Indiana get themselves into this position again? Just getting the game to overtime kind of felt like a little bit of an accomplishment given how many shots Ohio State had at winning it in regulation.
I would say yes, but also those 3 bunnies that were missed in a row, 1 by Goode and then 2 by Ballo at the end. I'm like, oh, we're right there. Just take it. I guess I even felt like, even with that scoring drought, there were 2 moments in the second half where I was like, okay, this team showed up in a different way today. One was when it was Galloway left Mobley for a wide open 3 at the top of the key. And I think it was Ballo who was shooting free throws the next possession after that. The entire time that he was shooting the free throws, Goode was just shouting at Trey Galloway. And I was like, I don't know if you've heard that. I don't know if it's a meme or a TikTok sound, the girls are fighting. I said to Dane, I was like, uh-oh, the boys are fighting. But I was like, that is something that, like, I don't know if you could see it on the broadcast, but it lasted over a minute. And I'm like, that is like the kind of attention to detail that this team has lacked. And then another point was when Ballo went up for that defensive rebound. He came down and he like came down awkwardly on his back and he slid and they ended up calling a travel. But like the reaction from him, it was not just like, okay, like let's move on. It like he was so mad. And then he was arguing with the ref after that he got shoved. They showed the replay. He didn't get touched, but I was like, that is like the type of intensity that, like, even if you're gonna get driven, like it's fine, but like show us that you're showing
Right.
up in this game. And I felt like those two big moments, I was like, this is what fans want to see from this team, regardless of what happens the rest of the season. Like, bring that intensity.
Yeah, no, that was absolutely something that had it appeared in my mind as well. And it's the thing. I mean, I think so much of Luke Goode's worth on the team is kind of interpreted through how many shots he's hitting from outside. And yet this is, I mean, we saw this in Atlantis. Like, he would have moments where he would go over and kind of yell at some of the guys, like, you got to do this and this. It is interesting that he's had to come in from outside in a lot of cases and bring that. There's probably some items that we could pull on there on another day to talk about, but it is fascinating watching him kind of grow into a very vocal leadership role, and it's kind of happening right around the same time that his numbers are getting back up to what they were last year. Like, with the performance last night, he's at 38.4% from three on the season, and he's shooting 46% from three in conference play. Last year, he shot 39% from three for the season, but only 37% in conference play. So we'll see how that meters out. But that bodes well, especially since he's starting regularly now with Malik Renew out of the lineup. I wanted to hit on, before we get to what happened in the overtime, I haven't watched that much Ohio State this year, but I'm amazed at A, how talented some of their players are individually, but B, the number of absolutely, like, ridiculously terrible shots that they put up. Like, I think there were 3 threes they took that didn't hit the rim, just caromed off the glass and went a different direction. I think I see that once a game maybe, but not 3 times, and not from the same guy each time, it felt like they were all coming from Mobley yesterday.
Yeah, they're a wildly inconsistent team. Like, the game before they played IU, they were down at Wisconsin by 17 at halftime. And, we're right in it, ended up losing by 2, had a chance to win. Bruce Thornton himself is such a talented player. I mean, he just abused IU on defense and their inability to recover when he was driving on them. But yeah, Mobley's good and Thornton's good. Bradshaw has been like wildly inconsistent. I felt like Kentucky, like, they seem to be an odd team in the fact that, like, the Kentucky game felt really emotional for them because that's where Bradshaw came from. And I felt like they came out with so much intensity and purpose in that game. They have talented players. The Michie Johnson situation is an odd one, and who knows if he'll end up coming back. But I think that, like, he would add a whole other element to this team. But them struggling, like, inside and really having, like, a center, I think is just a true center is gonna make it really hard for them to win in the Big Ten.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, they've lost all the games they've lost this year had been to teams that were in, like, the top 35 of Ken Pop. I mean, they lost to Texas A&M on the road, Pitt by 1 point at home. They got blown out at Maryland, which is weird. They lose to Auburn, which everybody loses to Auburn. Michigan State, who's good at home. Oregon at home, the game you were at, that Wisconsin game. And, from the numbers perspective, this was the first game they lost to a team outside of that realm. And yet they almost won it. And, you look at that overtime period, and the first couple of minutes overtime, it looked like Indiana was just dead in the water. I don't know what it was like from your perspective in your comfortable seats watching the game, but it kind of felt like Indiana was a spent force at that point, and Ohio State had gotten their mojo back and was going to coast with it.
Yeah, there were a few offensive possessions at the beginning of overtime. I'm like, what is going on here? And I mean, I just think that Ohio State was lacking purpose on the offensive end, and maybe that just was the difference in IU being able to finish it out. But yeah, overtime, the first half of it, it felt like Ohio State had all of the momentum. Then IU grabbed a little bit of it, and then it was like, hey, let's hold on for dear life here.
Yeah, and just the way that the overtime flowed, I look at those win probability charts a lot. Rarely do you see a game where one team has a nearly 90% winning chance in the first half. The other team gets all the way up to a 95% winning chance in the second half with like 3 minutes to play. Then the other team comes back and has an 82% win chance. And then it ends up that the other team ends up winning the game. It was so hard to follow. I was fascinated, I guess, by two things. Like, one, neither team really seemed to know exactly what it wanted to do in the overtime. Indiana was fortunate in a lot of ways in terms of like how the last couple of possessions played out. I'm still trying to figure out what the plan was for IU. It couldn't have been on that last possession. They couldn't have really wanted Kanan Carlisle to be the one dribbling the basketball. I don't know why Miles Rice wasn't in the game. Mike Woodson was pissed with that play, but I'm like, this is exactly what you set up at the beginning. I'm not sure what you have to be mad about here.
I thought that was such an interesting possession because like they had been subbing Rice out on the defensive end, but then they never subbed him back in for that offensive possession. And I wanted to stand up in my seat and say, wait, is Rice supposed to be in right now? Like, what is going on? So I was just a little confused by that because I do think that and I'll give Mike Woodson credit. I felt like the substitutions, other than maybe leaving Miles Rice out the entire first half, were so much better in this game. Like, I know that Goode and Ballo played the entire second half in overtime, but I felt like they needed to. Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, it was the same thing with like the end of regulation where he had clearly drawn up a play. I'm watching him. They're waiting until there's about like 10 seconds left on the shot clock. He like tells everybody to go. And then it ends up with Rice just like dribbling into a mid-range jumper that he missed. I was like, I'm not sure what the plan was here, but I don't know why that ball didn't go to Ballo.
Yeah. I mean, it was a really short bench for IU. Only 7 guys played total. And we basically didn't see Mackenzie Mbako for the entire second half or overtime. I think he played a couple of minutes at the beginning. We didn't see Miles Rice. Miles Rice played 15 minutes. Langdon Hatton played 5. It was a really tight bench, which is probably, I mean, the guys that played, and I think Anthony Leal playing 31 minutes is an indicator of a lot of things. But it is really interesting, shortening the bench and sticking with this group. Like, it does feel like if they get proper spacing offensively, they get just enough defensively out of that group that they can pull off some victories. And that last sequence that got Indiana what ended up being the winning basket was a good example. I mean, they get a decent shot at the rim. It doesn't go in, but Oumar Ballo gets the rebound and immediately cites Luke Goode, who's well spaced over in the corner, knocks the 3 down. And I mean, I don't think anybody thought those were the last points that were going to be scored. That was at the minute 7-second mark. It was like, the next possession, Mobley hits or misses the 3. Then the next possession, Indiana has the turnover, and then Ohio State gets an opportunity. I still don't know what Ohio State thought they were supposed to be doing on that last offensive possession. They waited so long to get it going. Anthony Leal made a great defensive play, and yet even with that, Bruce Thornton had a wide open look that went halfway down and somehow came back out again.
We were on the behind the basket on the opposite end, so I felt like I had like a very clear view of Thornton shooting that 3, and I'm like, oh, that looks online. And I'm just like watching like Trey Galloway's on the ground, like he is wide open. So, I mean, that was a messy possession. I thought that, it was going to be a great story to end the game with Leal having that lockdown defensive possession. And then when Thornton got that wide open look, I was like, oh no, this narrative could change really quickly. Yeah. I'm glad it didn't, obviously, but that was Yeah,
it was wild to watch because as soon as he put it up, I was like, that's going in. Like, the only hope is that he didn't get it off in time. And then it rattled out. And I think he was as surprised as anybody. Like, he turned around after that shot and was like, I can't believe that didn't go in. So, Yeah, I mean, it was what? How were there other IU fans in the arena? Like, was there any other kind of reaction on that?
Yes. I mean, I just thought of this, but it felt like the tale of two messes. Like both teams were just a mess. But
Yeah.
there were a decent amount of IU fans. There was a funny family in front of us where the mom was the IU grad, the dad was the Ohio State grad, and the kids with them were Ohio State fans. And I was looking at Dane and I'm like, is this my future? Like just me just rooting, being the only one here, like rooting for IU. And then I was actually sitting next to a girl who I didn't talk to her until halfway through the second half, but she's wearing all white. It was a whiteout. Well, come to find out, she's a Purdue grad. She's a Purdue fan, and she just came to the game to root against IU. So I feel like that was that was honestly like a tale of the crowd. Like the students were standing, and I mean they got loud when Ohio State started to go on that run to end regulation, but it was just so odd in there. It's just such a weird environment because I do think that during timeouts, they do fun games on the video board and it's loud. And I'm like, this crowd could make an impact on this game because clearly when they're getting loud, IU was a little flustered on offense. So I don't know. I don't even honestly know what to make of that game. I just was walking out of there like, I'm just glad that IU won, but what was going on?
Yeah, it's a weird one to parse because I mean you've got to look at that and say, well, you give Indiana a lot of credit because they could have folded up tent after the last couple of games, but they come out and play with some passion and energy, and that's good. It actually they fell a spot in KenPom. They went from 57th to 58th.
And didn't they go up one in the net?
Yes, they did. I mean, the problem is this was a game that statistically Indiana should have lost, but they ended up winning it. But it was really borderline. The defense allowed 1.07 points per possession, which does not help their overall number there. And their offense, while fine, was kind of subpar, I think, from what would have been expected. It's one of those games where you can kind of read whatever you want into it. There's a lot of people in the IU fan base who have kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, all right, well, hey, they won, great. There's some people who are like, see, the season's got a long way to go. And then there's other people who are like, this changes nothing. I don't know where to land on all of that. It was one of the better offensive performances Indiana had relative to opponent because Ohio State is normally a lot better at stopping teams from scoring. So I think Indiana gets a lot of credit for that. And you look across a lot of the statistical trends we've talked about on the show, they were very present in that game, right down to IU not turning the ball over, but not turning Ohio State over either, which is something that they tend to get turned over a little bit more. So I don't know. It's one of those games where now Indiana plays an opponent that's kind of on their level with Northwestern coming up here in the middle part of this upcoming week on the road. Can they maintain that same level of energy? I think I read somewhere that Mike Woodson's yet to beat Chris Collins, in a head-to-head matchup, which that's a weird stat, but it feels like I know Indiana's played Northwestern at home, but it feels like Indiana only plays Northwestern in Evanston. I don't know why, but it's like every time Northwestern on the schedule, like, oh, it's there. So it's one of those things, like you said, where there has to be consistency. They have to sustain this. If you can go in and win at Ohio State, who's certainly more talented than Northwestern is, I don't know why you couldn't go into Northwestern and win that game, but it's going to require that same degree of effort.
I just feel like, I mean, even going back to the Archie Miller era, I feel like there are just some teams in the Big Ten that IU should beat, but it just never happens. It's like, why Northwestern? I mean, that's why that win at the Palestra felt so good, because I was like, this is just finally, playing at Penn State has just been terrible for IU in the past. But, I feel like I obviously felt very negative about where the season was headed after the two games before this. But I will say, my first game watching in person, the energy coming from the bench to me was more than I've seen on TV. And I was very impressed with just the way that people were up. And I mean, the level of intensity. But I'm like, just keep doing it.
Right. No, I think that's what everybody's saying. It's like, that's great. I love seeing that. That's got to keep going. And I think the jury is still out about whether that's actually something that's going to continue. Because, again, I felt like we saw that in the game at the Palestra. I feel like we saw that to some degree in the game against USC, and then it just kind of vanished in the next two games. Why? I don't know. Why was it back for this? I don't know. Maybe this just ends up being one of those games or the seasons that just is very schizophrenic the rest of the way. It's going to be fascinating to watch.
One of my favorite things from watching in person they mention this every game, every time there's a new broadcast team. I feel like they have to talk about Oumar Ballo's free throws and the switching of the hand
Right.
and the thank you to Calbert Chaney. But I was watching Calbert Chaney whenever Ballo was at the free throw line, and I felt like he was just like willing them to go in. He's just totally forward in his seat, like his hands are crossed. And I was like, I love that intensity from him. He's like, this is my protege. Like, you got to make these, man.
Yeah, it's a sizable difference. Shot 49.5% last year. He's at 59% this year, basically. So that's and better here lately. I think his conference only free throws are up to 61%. So this is good. This is a positive thing to see alongside of what we saw out of Luke Goode and certainly some good play from some of the other guys out there as well. Well, you've got to go to every IU Ohio State game at in Columbus at this point, which I know you were going to do anyway, but I have to go back to the same, because I've been to the same bar 2 years in a row now, and it's not one I go to any other games for. And they've won both of those games. So now I feel obligated to head back there now.
I know. My only disappointment is that the women's team isn't coming to Columbus this year. We went to that game last year, and that was a frustrating one. I think that was really the difference between them being in the race to win the Big Ten and not. That was a frustrating one. So maybe I'll stay away if they do come back. But the men's team, I've got a good streak going. Football though. Well, the two games I went to were their two losses. So I'll have to enter next season with caution.
I mean, fortunately, the only time Indiana State would play would be either in the Big Ten title game or the national title game or somewhere in the playoffs next year. So we got that going for us at least.
Yes. I mean, gosh, I loved, and I hate to turn this to football, but I just loved Curt Cignetti's tweet so much with his notes on his desk with his rankings. When that's getting brought up in Ohio State circles around Columbus, I'm like, I just love that so much.
Yeah, the Cignetti people who want to criticize Cignetti don't realize how unusual it is for anything that an IU football coach does to become national news. It's being talked about on Ohio State message boards. It's on the college football Reddit. It's just all over the place, like that one little sheet of paper. It's been a masterful job by him for the last calendar year, using his desk to send messages that people pick up on.
Yeah, I think living in Columbus and just being immersed all of the time with the Ohio State fan talk has just been such an interesting thing to me, especially this season with their football season, but also with basketball. I mean, Dane was on the radio today and they were talking about the loss last night, and they kind of talk about Dusty May like he's the one that got away for them. And I just think that is so interesting because I'm like, I think that there's a lot of IU fans that are also saying that. So it's hilarious that is their like main thing. It's like, well, let's see how this works out with Diebler, but wow, we really could have had Dusty May. Yeah,
it's and Dusty May's done a great job at Michigan, but I've seen those same things from Ohio State fans in some circles, and it's just a really fascinating thing to unpack. I do want to ask you before we wrap up, the national championship game is Monday night, Notre Dame versus Ohio State. What's the attitude? I mean, we so much got talked about with the Ohio State fans and, losing the Michigan game and all of the angst and the disappointment and the anger around Ryan Day. And they've looked really good in the playoff. They're a 9.5 point favorite or something like that in this game. They're a really good betting favorite to win the national title. So how has the discourse been around football over the course of the last couple of weeks? Like what's the temperature of their fan base right now?
It's really interesting because I feel like half of the fan base is very confident and, in my opinion, underestimating Notre Dame. And then the other half of the fan base is mad that Ohio State is, an 8-point favorite in this game, saying like, I don't know how we're going to match up against this team. So much is being made of Notre Dame saying that, they're sticking with man coverage and everybody's like, okay, Jeremiah Smith is going to have, 2 touchdowns, 150 receiving yards. So it's interesting. I do think that, like, if they were to lose on Monday, the positive momentum that has been built up since the Michigan game, and then also that Jack Sawyer play last week, I just will be very, I mean, where does that fit in Ohio State history if they go on to lose this game? So I think that people are pretty worked up around here just because it's like this team set its goals at the beginning of the season that they wanted to win a national championship, and people had those expectations. So if they don't, I think it'll just be a very interesting offseason for the Buckeyes.
We'll keep an eye on it. Obviously, always curious and great to have you embedded in the culture over there so that we can get eyewitness reports on what's going on with things on a regular basis.
Yes, sometimes I enjoy being embedded in the culture more than other times. It just kind of depends on the day.
Well, I don't want to taunt the Wi-Fi gods any more than we already have. So we'll go ahead and wrap up. But Allie Sanzenbacher joining us. Was there at the Ohio State IU game last night and really appreciate your thoughts, and great to have you on the show for the first time. We'll do this again sometime soon.
I know. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem at all. We will do it soon at some point. But for now, we'll go ahead and wrap up. This is CrimsonCast for Allie and for the entire Back Home Network family. I'm Galen Clavio saying thanks for joining us here on the show. We will catch you folks on the flip side. Probably be back with Scott sometime early next week. We'll talk preview Indiana Northwestern, and we've got more football talk coming, folks. We're going to recap the transfer portal period with Taylor Lehman. Until then, stay never daunted. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.